can you tell us what a potlatch is from your perspective, and then we can continue? I just think it's important for other people who may not know.
Sure. That's a big question. Okay, so the word that is most often used instead of potlatch, certainly among the people that I interviewed from Coast Salish communities, is not potlatch, but gatherings. So folks were referring to, going to gatherings, and there was any sort of range of what those constituted. But the idea of potlatches is connected to work. So the idea of that communities and families have spiritual work to do, and it's connected to passing on resources, passing on property rights, passing on family names, and basically, in order to do that, because we had oral historical cultures, no written languages, that for thousands of years, our oral structures have been conducted within these gathering ceremonies. So that if you have, say, for an example, you want to pass on a fishing site from one family member to the next, you must have that conducted in the presence of other people so that it's recorded in their hearts and their minds. And in order to also conduct that work, that, there's all these pieces of the ceremony that give it legitimization. One of those would be, you've got to have witnesses. You've got to have gifting in order to mnemonically capture the transaction. So if I gift to you a paddle to symbolize that I passed down a piece of property from my uncle to my nephew, then you've got a symbol representing that moment in time. And it also ensures that if that transaction is contested in the future, you've got a set of people to look to in order to help you resolve that conflict.
Right.
In the future. You bring your witnesses together, and that's where it becomes an intergenerational connected system of transactions, basically, over time. So, and then you've got a feasting component. Now, I've taken a lot of interest in the idea of feasting. Why would you embed your transactions within a feast? Why would you have those two pieces come together? Or why would that be important to have those two pieces come together? And
you kind of see it today. Feasting's a big part of Indigenous, and I don't know if they all know exactly why. It right now it just is. Yes. So please continue. I just think that's interesting.
Mm-hmm. Because it's not the nature of the transaction that is only important. It's the quality of the relationship that is alongside the transaction that is important, which is why the feasting and the ceremonial component is important, because what you're recognizing is that there's a good relationship here that families and communities are wanting to show the world that we have these good relationships. And the way that you demonstrate that is to invite lots of other communities as well to say, not only are we good partners in this relationship, but they are too. Both of us are honorable, respectful. We care for one another enough to feed each other. And we also want to show each other kind of our best work. That makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It was one of the running rules I tried to have for guests was that it's because I think we fall into the career part sometimes too much. It's that my goal was to have a guest who not only acts in their own best interest, but is able to act in the best interest of their family, of their community, but not only to do that, but to be able to do that over a year 5 years, 10 years, pass that legacy onto their children, their to try and live in a way that's harmonious with the community and with themselves, in a sustainable way. Because you see people who are trying to do and this is no slight to mothers, but you can see when a mom's burning out and she's trying to do so much and she's so exhausted, and that's not unfortunately sustainable to be able to give your children the care that you'd like to, and that doing that is difficult. And obviously, I'm not picking on them, but you can see how not being sustainable will make it harder to continue long term. And so trying to find that balance, I think, is important, because then you share that and you pass that legacy on to your family, and your children and your grandchildren, so they can all start to live in that harmonious way. And that's sort of what you were just describing, which I think is interesting. The other part is, from my understanding, is there's that gifting element. It's also a sign of, I think, respect or honor to have given more, that the more you give in those moments, places, gives you prestige. Would you be able to elaborate or explain where I'm incorrect on that?
That's I think that's where it's really hard to think about. I'm sure that Sandy McKelsey would have talked about this, because he is one of the wisdom keepers that I interviewed for my research. But some of the elders talked about it as interest, that you give interest over time. There was a woman from Cowichan who spoke to me about that. And that seems to be a piece that is really fascinating to a lot of the world now, because in my thesis, I put together all these different words that came up from the interviews. One of them was interest, debt, savings, insurance, and banking. All those words came up in all the interviews. So I put these words together as a cluster because that's fascinating to me. That's all banking financial language, right? And yet the elders are all speaking about this with regards to ceremony and feast. That's not a coincidence, right? That's a distinct set of economic transactional language that signals the ways that communities are exchanging and sharing resources. But I'm also really careful that even though English is the language in which those concepts were explained to me in the interviews, because that's our default language now, that it's not the English word that should take center here, right? When we use the word debt, we're not talking about debt the way that we understand debt today. We're talking about ancient practices of indebtedness, which is embedded in relationships, right? We talk about debt as being, Larry Grant from Musqueam talks about it as intergenerational, that, if you and I create a debt relationship today, that it's unlikely that will sort of become balanced within our own lifetime. Because what we do through ceremony is we pass on the memory of those relationships to future generations. And that then creates a structure of social connectedness, right? Of embeddedness with one another, so that I am making sure that my children and my children's children, my grandchildren, have good relationships for the future. And the way that I do that is I create a debt relationship with you today. So that's really different, right? We're not talking about accruing debt, credit card debt, or anything like that. But that idea of interest always, especially in international contexts, comes up. Especially, there's a lot of shame connected to debt in other cultures, where interest is seen to be quite dangerous, because you can. It's unethical financial practice to have interest, because that's the way that you can then kind of cripple, the language that I use with regards to those original capitalist principles is like crippling your neighbor beyond repair, which is a competitive practice, which says there's one winner and one loser, and there's no coming out of it. Like you can't rebuild from that. The game is over at that stage.
Yeah, I think of Money Mart as a really good example
Exactly.
of that, because you see the prime customers are the exact people who will never be, like, I just don't understand, out of all the things, if I could just wave a wand, I would get rid of those businesses, because
Agree.
I don't understand how it's our most vulnerable people who are being sent into the worst agreements possible, and just end up in this spiral. And it's like you watch any documentary on them, it's almost instantaneous that you're stuck in a system that you cannot get out of. And it just seems malevolent that we allow those to kind of operate within our communities, in our downtown communities that typically have those. It's not like they say you can have them, but you have to have them in nicer neighborhoods with more wealthy people. It's like, no, we put them in the worst spot where people are going to be desperate and need these services. It just seems crazy to me.
Yeah. Paired with that preying on vulnerable people. And one of the things too that came up in the research was also this shift from a system. I think it was Kat Penyer spoke about this from Skowlitz, that the shift from a system of freely giving, right? If you come from a society and a structure where if I have surplus, I give it away. And then you've got these Western values and principles that start to come into play, are forced upon us. And in fact, we are punished by not adopting those principles. That has shown to have detrimental impacts on our communities, because if I'm not used to the mindset of accumulation, it looks like I'm poor all the time, even though from an Indigenous perspective, I have lots of good relationships, which is a form of wealth as well. So I talk about that a lot too, is like, what is this paradox of wealth and poverty? Because what we have is two very different definitions of wealth and poverty, and they're operating at the same time. It depends, though, when you value that and when dominant society diminishes the value of Indigenous wealth, right?